It's really good to see you all. Glad you could make it here today for a webinar, really, which is about encouraging and helping us in our mission and ministry within our social housing estates. And I'm delighted to welcome Andy Delmege, who's our speaker this afternoon. Andy was formerly Executive Director of the National Estate Churches Network, and from July this year, he's become the Canon Missioner of Birmingham Cathedral. So we hope that's working out for you at the moment, Andy. No doubt you can tell us whether it is or not in a moment or two. The network itself exists to support people who are active in Christian ministry on social housing estates in England and Wales via a network of local groups, as well as conferences, resources, social media, and so on. Rochester Diocese currently has a small group of people represented here today who are committed to supporting one another as they minister within social housing estates. We actually have around 50 parishes that have more than 500 social housing homes. And many of us are trying to figure out how we connect meaningfully with our estates. We want to serve and not to patronise, to listen and not to lecture, to find out what God is already doing rather than telling him what he should be doing from the sidelines. We'd probably admit that the Church of England has struggled with this kind of ministry for reasons which we'll no doubt discuss today. And it's led to an imbalance in the representation of people in the church, and more significantly still, a sense that social housing estates are not a priority in the gospel. None of us would sign up to that latter point, but it's somehow happened by default in some places. So today is not about laying guilt on any of us. We are where we are. There is in fact much that we can learn from one another and from the excellent resources that the network provides. And locally here in Rochester, we have the chance to galvanise greater support for some of our neediest communities at a moment of acute vulnerability. I'm sure that at the end of the seminar, we'll each have learned something new and been inspired to try something different. And I hope especially that it will lead to the expansion of the group of people who are committed to one another in this diocese, in social housing estates, mission and ministry. At the moment, the group is relatively small. We'd want to expand that. And no doubt Andy this afternoon can help us just reflect on how we might do that to encourage others to be involved. But it's going to be quite an open forum this afternoon. I'm going to hand over to Andy in just a moment. And it's to say, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and to make observations when he's finished speaking, because he wants to keep this very much a dialogue rather than just one single block presentation this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andy, thanking him very much for his time. I'm glad he didn't have to travel down from Birmingham to do this, but really appreciate his involvement today. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks very much. It's good to see you all. I know some of you, and some of you I don't know, but it's really good to be with you. I think, as Bishop Simon has just said, actually, I think the ability to do things like this on Zoom, which we've all suddenly been thrust into, is a really helpful thing, actually, isn't it? I mean, it's great for me that, particularly at the moment, not having to travel sort of across the country to do stuff, but equally, it's how we get people together properly in quite a dispersed time, I think is really important. So I've been introduced. So I was in a state ministry for about 20 years till the end of July, and I'm in the slightly different sphere of the cathedral now, although the cathedral, lots of sharp end city centre homelessness ministry going on there, which is good to be involved in. And as we're NECN's in between executive directors at the moment, they're in the process of appointing somebody new. I said I'd still come and do this, so hopefully that's okay with you all to have me here with you this afternoon. What I wanted to do was to try to keep this as sort of dialogical as possible. So rather than me sort of spouting for an hour, for us to have a bit of a conversation going on. So please, stick your hand up or say something if I can't see you, or use chat, and we'll try and sort of keep a conversation going. And I think what I've been trying to do with things like this is to try to do a bit of connecting up what's happening nationally with what's happening locally, if that makes sense. And then also, if I listen to you in terms of what's going on in your bit of England, I can feed that back in nationally as well. So it's great to be here and listening to you. Do you all know about National Estate Church Network? So most of you, Roger certainly does, but NECN is a ecumenical charity that's been around for about 25 years. A lot of the time it was chaired by Bishop Laurie Green. And I think it did a really good job in sort of flying the flag for estates ministry, particularly during a period for the time, sort of following on from Faith in the City into the sort of 2000s, when estate ministry really was very much the sort of forgotten corner, really, of the Church of England. About, not quite sure how long ago it would have been, probably be about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. Archbishop's Council were asking which bit of the Church of England the decline was worst, was fastest. And I think the answer came back, it's the urban estates. So then the question came back, well, why is that? And when they looked at that, what came back was, well, we're funding them a lot less than we are elsewhere, not deliberately, but that's just what had happened. And quite a lot of places around the country, you'd find parishes being amalgamated. We know on quite a lot of estates, the church buildings were built maybe sort of fairly early on after the war, so materials weren't good. There's not been the money to keep them in good repair, so quite often, seeing a few smiles, so quite often you end up with the buildings have become knackered, and perhaps there was a kind of accidental withdrawing from the estate as amalgamations went on. And I think also just the sort of lack of thought really about, state ministry is quite tough, isn't it? And we need our, good leadership in estate churches in order for them to flourish, and that just hadn't happened for quite a while. There'd not been an attempt to sort of really put estate ministry at the fore. When all this happened 6 or 7 years ago, Bishop Philip North really sort of picked up the mantle in quite an effective way, and that held a big conference at the obvious place to go for housing estate ministry, to Bishopthorpe Palace in York, for a day. And I think each diocese was asked to send a couple of people. I don't know if anybody from this group from Rochester was able to get there. It was obviously sort of people from the North and the Midlands, where it's much easier to get up to York for the day. And that was an extremely good conference, largely because each diocese had sent a couple of people who really enjoyed doing estate ministry. So there's lots of enthusiasm in the room, rather than those sorts of things I think we've probably all been at, where everybody moans about how hard it is and how misunderstood they are, and then goes away feeling worse. But coming from that, it's very easy to have a conference where everybody feels good and then nothing happens. So it was important to ensure that there was a difference being made. So a group with the very unwieldy title of the Estates Evangelism Task Group got set up. And one of the good things about that was it became a standalone group within Renewal and Reform in the Church of England. You know, that can be the sort of thing which can just lead to a lot of people coming for a meeting occasionally in London and then going away feeling, you know, gassing and feeling better and not doing anything. But this group's certainly been about trying to make change. And I think we've managed to do that in a few ways. I should say Estates Evangelism Task Group is very much about kind of top-down change within the Church of England and helping dioceses to think about how they're investing in estates and things like that, sharing good practice. At the same time as that, National State Church Network, we managed to get a load of new energy into that. So it's working alongside Estates Evangelism Task Group, but hopefully a much more kind of bottom-up or organic mechanism, because we need to have something that's much more representing churches and church leaders on the ground and speaking into structure from that rather than something that just represents structure. Between the two of us, I think we've done hopefully quite a good job the last few years. I mean, we've certainly seen the Commissioner's funding going far more towards not just to estates, but areas more generally in economic deprivation. So I think something like it's now something like about a third of SDF money goes towards estates and other areas of deprivation. I think the sort of high water mark so far was General Synod the February before last, where there was a debate about estates ministry and estates evangelism, and Synod unanimously voted to see a flourishing worshipping community on every significant estate in the country, which is quite a positive thing. The job is making sure that happens, because Synod will vote for apple pie, I think. So it's making sure that we get reality on the back of that. In the meantime, we've had a sort of flourishing of this sort of group, and I can certainly talk about what's happening in groups in other parts of the country, just to share a bit of good practice if you'd like. We managed to get a national grant from All Churches Trust, which meant NECN got some money for a part-time staff worker and a part-time admin worker. So that means we're not doing stuff in people's spare time, which is always quite a helpful thing. And we also got some money for a couple of pilot learning pathways for leaders from estates, one in London and one in Birmingham. And we've been doing a bit of sharing with what's happening in other parts of the country. It's great to see Sharon with us here today. Be good to catch up a bit on what's happening in what you're doing with sort of local leadership in Rochester. We're also sort of looking to get stuff that works on estates into people's hands, because we all know that there's loads of stuff out there that you have to do a lot of work on to get it to fit estates, but there's increasing amount of stuff which is much more bespoke, and one of the things we're looking at doing as much as we can is sharing that. If you go onto the NECN website, which is estatechurches.org, you'll see there's a sort of left-hand panel that's there, whichever page you're on. And if you go onto the left-hand panel, there's a bit where if you can join the mailing list. And if you join the mailing list, which is free, you've joined NECN, and you'll just get you won't be bombarded with stuff, because we know how much stuff goes into clergy and lay leaders' intros, but just occasional stuff that will sort of help with stuff. We're trying to do a few conferences a year. It's actually been really interesting this year that the forced move onto Zoom and the learning how to do stuff on Zoom. Actually, I think it's been quite successful because it's meant we've been able to get more people together more easily. In fact, that there's going to be a sort of London regional conference. Roger, have you been involved in that? Yeah, and Bishop Simon's going to be that quite soon. So that's on Thursday, the 8th of October, and that's about local leadership on estates, particularly, I think, looking from a BAME perspective. And again, if you wanted to come to that on Zoom, it's free. If you just look on the website and email Christine, who's administering it, she'll send you the information about that. I'm going to stop waffling just at this point, just to ask if there's any questions or any comments people would like to make.
Andy, if I could just add to what you've just said about the London conference, there is a brilliant promotional video, short video with Bishop Philip North, which is available to watch on YouTube. And again, I think on the NETN website, you'll see that. So I did share that locally, and I did send, I think, a link. I can't see Jenny there. She's turned her camera off, but I did send a link to the Diocesan Communications. Did you get that, Jenny? You're muted.
I did, but I'll check it and send it to me again.
Okay, right.
I might well
Thanks.
can't remember. I've been so busy this I have no idea what my name is even. So.
Okay.
But I think certainly the idea with this is to try to get as much stuff out which is as helpful to people from estate churches as possible. So it's definitely been very much a listening exercise, and I think sort of everybody who's been involved in it have been people who are sort of actively involved in estate ministry. So it's definitely coming from us rather than it coming from externally. And I think the emphasis particularly on local leadership, which our main summer conference was about, and then this more regional one for London, is just because that's been where the greatest energy has been whenever we've had people together recently. Anybody else got any questions or comments at this stage? In which case, I'm going to go on talking, if that's okay. One of the things which the task group has been doing is obviously, in terms of needing to be trying to be effective, it's come up with a strategy which it's trying to work towards, and also trying to consult with as many partners as possible to make sure it's right and fitting the place, fitting the spot. One of the things which we've just been involved in with that is actually revising the strands which the strategy is working towards. So one of those is around what Synod voted for, which is a worshipping community on every estate. I think it would be good to have a little bit of a conversation with you in a minute about how the coronavirus pandemic might be affecting that, because it's going to be slightly different in each place, but obviously the financial crisis which is affecting the church at the moment, I think is likely to hit that, and I think there's quite a lot of work which we need to be doing to sort of try and help the church to continue to see estate churches as being gift and grace to the church rather than financial millstone. You don't do anything else because of that. Bishop Simon alluded at the beginning to the theological underpinning for all of this, and I think one of the key parts of it really is that I think if the church loses its ministry on estates, or it loses its ministry in wider places of deprivation, it's lost the gospel. that's one of the things we need to be reminding people about. And I think also one of the things which Bishop Philip keeps saying is that I think looking back at Christian history, whenever there's been a revival and renewal of the church, it's tended to come from the margins and from the places of deprivation. So I think we're looking to, places like the estates really to be speaking prophetically, and that's where God and the Spirit are. So we need to kind of keep our morale up, I think, about that. So there's a strand around ensuring there's a worshipping community in every estate. I think one thing that's really important about that is nobody's trying to define what the worshipping community should look like, because I know there's all sorts of twitchiness about that from all sorts of areas, but whether it's an existing traditional style church, there's plenty of traditional existing style estate churches across the country, not least a load of yours, which are doing fantastic work. In some cases, it might need to be a plant or a fresh expression or a revitalisation. There's not any one size fits all on that. We want that to be something which is able to just to be bespoke and fit the local area the best without undermining anybody else. We've spoken about leadership a bit. There's a second strand which is on leadership, and that's a dual strand. Partly it's just making sure that leaders who are coming in from outside are as well equipped and trained in order to do estate ministry as well as they can, while at the same time looking to build up local leadership as well as we can. And we can talk about that a bit more again in a minute, and particularly hear about what's happening with you in Rochester, and I can share what's happening a bit more widely around the country with that. But I think there are a couple of particular things around that. I mean, one of which is quite often good local leaders actually can do it really well because they know the culture, don't have to change anything. We've got a couple of 2 or 3 parishes in Birmingham where we've had to put in local leaders as minister in charge. Well, kind of had to happen by default because nobody would go and serve in parishes which were on their last legs, with full-time stipendiary clergy having left them in parlous situations. And actually those parishes are in resurrection in different ways. Having the right local leaders in can really change things. People who know the culture, know how to speak into it really well. So the dual thing of just supporting whatever sort of leadership it is. A third strand is effective partnerships and resources. There's increasingly kind of less money around and to do things with. So I think working with other people is such a key thing. And however that can be, which partners have you got in your place who you can be working with? There's usually somebody. Just trying to work with other partners who are around. If there's nobody, what partners can we find who we can bring in? Also helping wider partners. Say, for example, some of the parachurch organisations might be able to come up with more bespoke stuff for estates if we can help them do it. I think there's quite often a lot of enthusiasm for that, and we've got some good examples of that. So for example, Leading Your Church into Growth, for example, now do a estates conference once a year, which is a great thing because you get a load of estate church leaders and estate church members in the room together, all sharing really positively about how growth can happen. And we know it's hard on estates, it's probably the hardest place, but we can have slow growth. You know, it's not easy, but we can do it over time. Just to, you know, make sure we're there effectively, and also just getting the resources which work for estates into your hands. And there'll certainly be a load of stuff on the website with links to different resources, and if you know of anything that's working where you are, we'd love to hear the story and have that shared with other people. And then the fourth strand we've got at the moment is around children and young people and schools. Schools are quite often a really effective partnering we can do. We know quite often we're struggling to have many children, but just thinking about what we can do to prioritise stuff for children and young people on estates, quite often where the church can be really something that can have a deep effect actually on people and people's lives. So is that kind of chiming in with you as to what priorities are for where you are? I wonder if we could share the screen just to make, so I can see everybody rather than just a load of people at the top just for this bit.
Should have everyone on gallery view, actually.
Hang on, let me just try. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, got it back to gallery view. Thank you. I could just see myself. So, so is that chiming in at all with you all? Is there anything that's missing from that, do you think? Stuff that's important for you at the moment in your ministry, in your context?
I don't want to jump in because I want people from the parishes to say what's going on. Really, it'd be really great to hear from people. I think, but certainly those are really key areas. And personally, I'd be very interested to learn more about children and young people and schools, about how stuff has been done well nationally. It could well be, Andy, coming out of this, thinking about one or two of these strands. If you could direct us to one or two people we could approach, we could continue to resource this group and maybe a larger group on those questions.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a couple of really obvious people to speak to around children, young people in schools. So there's a colleague called Sarah Barron, and Sarah's the field officer for a little charity called Curbs, Children in Urban Situations. And they do a lot of sort of bespoke stuff for really for children and things on estates. So I think Sarah would have a lot of knowledge. The other person, somebody called Dawn Savage, and Dawn works half-time for Diocese of Leeds as one of their children and youth team, and half-time for Jesus Shaped People, which again is one of the really good resources we've got for estate churches. Comes from estates in Bradford, and it's really useful. I'm trying to contextualise it for the cathedral at the moment, which is an interesting job because normally we're contextualising the other way. But again, I mean, Dawn does the children and young people stuff for Jesus Shaped People, and has a real kind of knowledge of how stuff really works in terms of children and young people. So I think I would ask for one of those to come in and speak to you, and I can put you in touch with them quite easily. But I think sort of getting somebody in who's specialised on that makes some sense. One of the things actually we've done in Birmingham, which has worked quite well, is try to scoop up anybody who's involved in children's work from estate parishes, whether that's your Sunday school leaders, or somebody who does a youth club, or somebody who leads a messy church, or whatever, just to get them together about once a term over the cup of tea and cake, and just to kind of talk through what you know, what issues and good practice are. It was partially because quite often certainly in Birmingham, the diocesan stuff appears to be a bit more sometimes geared towards, you know, when you've got about 3 youth groups, which most of us wouldn't have. And also, you know, I think just having, you know, the people who are together in the same boat, and that's, you know, it's a very easy thing to do that's quite inexpensive really. But also what we had found with that were there were a lot of people were coming up with some really good bits of practice, which were really creative and imaginative, which they didn't think were new and creative and imaginative because it's what they did ordinarily. And actually sharing those with other people just made quite a difference. Or also, I think, you know, with estate stuff, we all know what it's like when it's quite hard. You know, you might have had prepared a load of stuff and one child came or something like that. So actually being able to share that, it's not embarrassing because everybody else knows it, and you work your way through that. So I think that's also a good model just to think about, is just if you can pull people together for that. But you know, there certainly is, I think, increasing amounts of stuff that's around and about with that. But I think I try and get Sarah or Dawn in to speak to another one of these, and certainly, you know, doing it on Zoom is much easier because, you know, there isn't travel time for whoever the speaker is, which is handy. So.
Could I leap in?
Please.
Hi, I'm slightly here perhaps under false pretenses because I'm actually in a sort of semi-rural parish, but something like 1/4 of the population is in social housing in a big patch of estate, and I'm sort of puzzling really what to do with them and how to work that in. And I just wondered whether there was anything you could say about that kind of intersection of the rural ministry and estate ministry. You know, it's not all urban.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? And I think sometimes when we've sort of raised estate ministry up, you know, sometimes you get other people in the church who feel a bit threatened and say, well, you know, what about so and so? What about so and so? What about rural? And I think one of the things we suddenly realised was almost it would be quite hard to find a village in the country that doesn't have doesn't have at least one street of social housing. Usually on the edge, isn't it? There are those little streets of social housing. So everybody has some sort of social housing, I think. And I think there was also a bit of a feeling that actually putting a bit of emphasis onto estates was on the principle that if it'll work on an estate, it'll work elsewhere. You know, actually, you know, sort of work out some of the toughest places to try and come up with some missional approaches, and then you can just do the work to make sure they fit in other places. I think, yeah, trying to work out how to do ministry where you are somewhere which is a bit diverse is always a bit of a, you know, it is a bit of a head scratcher, and that will kind of vary a little bit according to, I guess, local circumstances of that parish, because you know, you can have, for example, you know, there's obviously, you've got parishes which are pretty well all estates. You know, I was priest in charge for a while at a big 1930s council estate called Wheely Castle, and I think there might have been a couple of roads which weren't social housing, but you know, the rest of the 12,000 people were. But then you can have, you know, as you say, a bit of rural and mixed social housing, or you can have suburban and social housing. So I think what I sort of say, where are your buildings? Are they in, you know, your church?
Not in the social housing estate.
That's usually
on the edge, on the other end of the village.
That's usually the case. And I guess it's going to depend a little bit, again, on local context, which you know, everybody will know their own local context better than I do. But quite often people from social housing, it's a real barrier to get them to go off of it. So I guess it's working out how you can do stuff which goes to where they are. I think. So whether there's any facilities, there aren't any.
Of course not.
Full stop. Yeah. So so it might just be whether, you know, I think a key thing is just sort of building up personal relationships with people and trust in order to start with, because you're not going to get anywhere without those. So it's, you know, it's just working out ways in which you can spend time with people, I think, to start with, and particularly, quite often we make, you know, we're not starting from scratch, are we? We're actually, you know, we're working on what's gone on in the past, and quite often people have been sort of, you know, hurt a bit in the, you know, by what church has or hasn't done, or what church has been seen to do, or what attitudes it's been seen to have. So you know, it's breaking through that, which is, you know, building up as much trust, I think, as we can. But I think from that, it would be then sort of just trying to work out some stuff that people might actually want to go to, which you can only work out by asking them, really, and building up those relationships. So, you know, whether it's, you know, if you've got a cafe or somewhere unthreatening, you might, or a community centre, you might want to be working, if you can do something in that. If not, use your church, because that, but put on something that people, you know, people want to come to, I think would be a key thing. Sometimes we get a bit frightened about talking about Jesus. I don't think people mind that, because we're the church and they expect us to do it. You know, so I wouldn't be, you know, worried about that. But, you know, I think it's just very, very slow, patient stuff. But stuff can come into being that, you know, maybe we don't expect sometimes as well. I was in the last parish I was in. We ended up hosting in the building a very good local secular domestic abuse charity, and just by building up relationships very slowly over years, it took a long time. We ended up, before I left, with a little congregation of survivors of domestic abuse, which was quite amazing and sort of quite humbling thing, really. So you can, just by, you know, I think the key thing is just trying to build relationships with people. Put something on for the children. That's a really obvious place to start. And I think, I mean, obviously a lot of this is, you know, hopefully when we can get that together and things like that. I mean, we can't do it at the moment, but I think one of the things is always do food. Always do food and never charge for it, because, you know, people are quite often hungry. And people will come for something to eat, but just make sure it's the sort of things, you know, build up relationships with one or two people, just to find out things that people will like. And quite often there's, you know, within these little communities, there's one or two people who connect to everybody else, and if you can find them, then they'll be the people. Although I was talking to a colleague up in Blackpool who planted a very, you know, what's actually a really, you know, they've done a great job at planting a church from nothing. But one of the things she said was, we found this family who were obviously the key family to get on board. But then she said, we had bother with another couple of families. And because we knew this family, when we had bother with them, they left the estate. And you think, is that a sort of, you know, perhaps you might not want to be in contact with them. But is that all right, Anne? Does that answer that a bit? But, and I think just share with other people around you, you know, in this group about it as well, because there's probably other people who've got some ideas about that.
Can I just share some
Please, Jim.
information? Yeah. I'm Jim. I'm from Slade Green, which is on the River Thames, just north of Dartford, and it's a sort of backwater of the London Borough of Bexley, where over the years people just ended up there and were totally forgotten. And I started off there as a curate 3 years ago. I'm now the vicar, and I joined with the Archdeacon, who was the priest, and I sort of his sidekick, and we built the church back up because it had really gone rock bottom. The community had lost complete confidence in the church, and it was And first of all, when I started walking the streets, I got some very strange looks from people. But now people stop and talk and have conversations, and that goes right down to the children from the schools. It's great because they say, "Hello, Reverend Jim," and the parents start chatting. But going back to the food piece that you mentioned a few moments ago, when I came as a curate, I made a suggestion we might offer a pancake evening on Pancake Day. And I was politely told by the congregation, no one will come. So I said, well, if we don't try it, we won't know. Well, 80 children and 40 adults turned up, and it was free. We've done it every year since, and it's the same. And one year, the family, several parents said to me, what else do you offer for the children? And I thought, not sure, not a lot. And then not long after, I was approached to say, we might be able to get some funding from the SDF for you. What would you like? And I thought, children's family worker. And we're interviewing tomorrow, so prayers for that, please.
Lots of prayers.
We might be fortunate in to secure an appointment. But one of the problems we have locally, things were really beginning to motor before lockdown. Lots of green shoots, lots of enthusiasm. And like everyone, bang, it went down. And we've had to convert, like many churches, to online services. But there's an awful lot of people in Slade Green don't have the access to what we have, the privilege of a laptop. They might have their phone, and it's too much effort. Even the schools had challenges in lockdown with the children. They were not able to do their work online. And I think we sometimes think now, oh, this is a new normal. Everyone's online, but not everybody is.
No, absolutely, and that sort of inclusion is so vital, isn't it? You know, remember in lockdown there were, you know, quite a few of us were, you know, spending whatever we had in discretionary funds or whatever, you know, on laptops, tablets for kids, because you know, if you sort of find you've got a family of 5 and they've got one mobile phone which they're trying to do the homework on, you know, that's almost impossible. Sharon.
Well, it's not always the hardware, in truth. It's quite often it's the data. And accessing the data, and sometimes the hardware is only one piece of hardware for 7 people in the household, or can bring over to. So I mean, schools are probably more expert in it than churches, I would think, because they're having this problem. But certainly, in our urban areas, we don't have a problem getting access onto broadband, but actually financially, that's the massive barrier, and you can't. I'm yet to find where you can get funding to. Yeah.
So I think there's a basic issue about inclusion there, isn't there? And I think about, you know, it's quite a vital one. You know, it's you know, so much is going online, and how we make sure we can include people, which we haven't really got to the.
Resourcing, I was just going to mention that how you can quickly get you can make ground quite quickly in our areas, because people are so hungry, well, literally quite often, but you know, for activity, particularly if you've got things around families, young children, if that's where you're kind of what your area is about. But one of the problems in our kinds of churches very often is that we are low resourcing in terms of capacity of people. So we can set something up, so you can do your pancake party and have a massive success, but actually then to be able to continue and build on that is exhausting, because it comes down to probably the vicar and whatever goodwill you've managed to trade up with people, but that's only ever for it seems to me, a very short season. I'd love to hear from churches that aren't super resourced with people, who have been able to sustain, you know, levels of engagement.
I mean, I think there's maybe something about the local leadership kind of fitting into that as well, about how we can build people up, because you know, because quite often I think the church might be one of the few places actually where people get that chance to grow and be fulfilled. You know, schools are much better than they were on estates, but there's still kind of quite a lot of scars, and they're not always great. And historically, it means quite often people on estates are very suspicious of formal education. You know, the things where working class people used to grow and flourish largely aren't there anymore. You know, trade unions are denuded, and people are quite often, you know, not in the sorts of jobs where you get progression. You know, if you're doing cleaning or deliveries or something like that, you're not going to get skilled up and grow. Sharon, did you want to just talk about what's happening in Rochester in terms of the local leadership stuff? Or?
Well, I can't speak for the whole diocese, but I can speak for the deaneries in Medway. The area deans in Medway it's slightly changed who we've got now, but a few years ago were quite concerned that we weren't building up enough laity to be able to upskill them into leadership prior to perhaps having vocational callings to licensed or ordained ministry. So this is just to equip, and not always. Yeah, I knew that, Jenny. Actually, that was helpful. But not always with a view to perhaps, you know, developing into licensed ministries. So I can't remember how long ago now, perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, ran adapted growing leaders, which is a CPAS in origin course, and we ran that over a year with about 30 people across Medway, different people who perhaps had been maybe would have capacity for leading small groups, that kind of thing, or Sunday schools and so on. We ran that. We've just run at the beginning of the year prior to lockdown. We adapted a diocesan, so an internal diocesan course here in God's Word. We adapted that for the Medway context, and we're this Saturday we start the next one on, which is Speaking God's Word. And the advantage of doing that for us was, first of all, we can rewrite them so we can be really locally responsive, and there's a lot of similarities across Medway, and it has got its own particular and peculiar culture. The churches in particular have got a peculiar culture, I think, and we can therefore make them much more contextually relevant. I'm not saying that diocesan courses aren't contextually relevant, but sometimes you want it a bit nuanced. And of course, the advantage of when you take something and run it yourself, you can broaden out if you need to with theology, which sometimes has been necessary. So, or even change the theology, perhaps, depending on where you're from. So, so that's what we've run. We were going to do this on kind of like a 3-year running programme. So the next kind of year would be around smaller sort of pastoral capacity. But the reason we started with growing leaders was because that's a particular course that talks about kind of character before gifting. So rather than equipping people and say, this is how you lead, this is how you do it, so it's not tools and techniques, it's much more about who am I, what gifts therefore do I have, and how would I want to use those gifts. So it does talk about leadership specifically, but it spends a huge amount of time, probably half the course, particularly on discipleship, really, and grounding people so that they're starting. So we would. Yeah, so we've got that on kind of 3-year rolling programme. But of course, lockdown has changed all that. But some of the people that started with growing leaders have kind of continued in and want more, and those that have engaged have really wanted to continue to engage. And individual churches run it as well, some of these things, and not everybody wants to engage across, but it's been really helpful because people have cross-fertilised. Medway's quite a weird, small geographical area, I think, and people do know each other. Across the church, well, in fact they do anyway, don't they, in all areas. So that's been nice because then we've shared different churches have been able to share. Is that what you're asking?
That is, yeah. And these sorts of things really seem to be bubbling up across the country. So shall I just sort of speak a little bit about some of the other things which are around with this? There's a project in Blackburn Diocese, so I think centred on Darwin, which is I think in the news at the moment because it's the highest COVID rate, I think.
I was a curate in Darwin, actually, Andy.
Ah, brilliant.
Puritan Darwin, so I know all about Darwin.
You know all about Darwin, yeah. Well, so Tim Horrobin, who's a vicar there's really sort of started it off, and then also expanding into Blackpool now. Sort of Blackpool's got the parishes which are I think something like number 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the cuff deprivation statistics, and that's really been a process of trying to build up local leadership from within within churches, and also trying to form existing clergy to be looking out to build up local leadership, because that's quite often a sticking point. We're not often very good at recognising the gifts of the people around us, or it can be hard. And then sort of getting people through a course, which really they end up being I think it's a licensed lay leader there. But then they've also, I think the Northwest Diocese have just formed a new TEI, which will have a pathway for people to go through for ordination, for people who come from sort of non-standard academic backgrounds. There's the All Churches funded pilot in London. So that's headed by Helen Shannon, who is a pioneer minister in East Finchley. She runs a church called Church at 5, because it meets at 5 on a Sunday afternoon. And Helen is really a kind of very local estate woman. And I think in London, particularly North London, you've got obviously everywhere's within a parish, but you've got quite a lot of small social housing estates, which actually the local parish just doesn't impact on at all. So what the model is there is that they're running something called the Estates course for folk in estate churches, perhaps who are very new to estate church, building them up actually to be planters. So I think the bit of vision they've got, and I think it's very fascinating there that kind of HTB has kind of changed gear very, very much in that part of London. So they're looking to plant, but when they plant, it's with the expectation that they'll be raising a new generation of planters to plant on the next estate. But that new generation are going to be local people who they've evangelised. So rather than it being, you send 30 people who are, middle class people onto an estate, it's actually you're raising people up who can plant locally, which I think is a really fascinating model with that. So you're looking at lay evangelists really, and lay planters being formed through that. And then in Birmingham again, we've got something which is slightly different, and this is slightly due to our context. Birmingham, depending on how you measure it, is the poorest diocese, so we don't have much slack in terms of what we're doing. We have been cutting stipendiary clergy so that we've cut our cloth. We're not we won't be having to continually cut as external funding doesn't come in. Alongside that, I think there's been a bit of a sort of theological vision underpinning this. There's a very interesting missionary theologian in the 20th century called Roland Allen, who was an SPG missionary in China, who wrote a book called Missionary Methods, Ours or St. Paul's. It's a very boring book, but it's got some gems in it. And one of the things he says is God gives the local church the gifts it needs in order to do what God wants it to do. Does that make some sense? So God gives the local church the gifts it needs in order to do what it needs to do. And I think we've been sort of thinking about that really in terms of leadership, actually. I think sometimes for estate churches, we do need a bit of external help, but that might be through things like a treasurer or something like that. But the leadership of the church, I think, there's no reason at all why it can't come from within. And we've got these 2 or 3 parishes where, because the archdeacons couldn't get anybody to serve in them, we've ended up with a local reader. And bearing in mind, Birmingham's got a non-academic reader scheme. You know, they're genuinely quite local readers, with oversight ministry from a stipendiary priest in a nearby parish. And these 3 parishes have gone from, you know, absolute death, you know, being on, you know, almost about to close, to really being in resurrection in all sorts of interesting ways. And there's obviously quite a lot of vulnerability in them. So the scheme's really to try and make that happen in other places, really. So we're running a pilot at the moment, which we got to the end of the first of 3 years of, where we're building a number of people up to be doing that. What's going to happen is they'll either come out the other end of it, either as licensed lay leaders or ordained. I think the bishop said local ministers, but they're not OLMs in the traditional sense. They're not auxiliary priests. They're priests who are leading that parish under oversight from somebody nearby. The great thing about all of this is those 3 schemes are all being evaluated quite deeply by Church Army. So there will be a report for the wider church coming up from that. What I would guess with the financial issues facing us as we go ahead is I think we're going to need more things like this, because we're going to have less stipendiary clergy going around. So how we can be building people up. I remember when we were finding the people to go on the pilot, I was asking colleagues, who have you got who might go on this? Because it's much easier to design a pilot around existing people rather than design a course and then try and fit people into it. And I had 4 different responses, which was really interesting. So first of all, it was, yeah, we've got Jan, which is a great response. Second response was, well, everybody we've had who might do this, we've got through existing training schemes, which again is fine. That's a great response. Third response was, Andy, you're being very vague, tell me more, which again is fair enough. And then there was a 4th response, which was, we haven't got anybody because the context is too hard. The only difference in the context between the 4th response and the first 3 responses was whoever the vicar was. So actually, I think it's part of our job is to be looking at the gifts of people around us and encouraging people and raising them up, which can be long and slow work, but it can be done. And I think having faith in our people is a real key thing on that. Right, I've been waffling for too long. Any more comments or questions or anything anybody wanted to ask about?
Do you want to say a word about the partnerships question, which was an interesting one, because one way we've approached this within the diocese, and indeed it's represented in some of the parishes here, is to form community hubs. This is a welcome concept, you know, basically throw open the church, invite the agencies in so that they can talk to one another, for one thing. And you're making the church a safe space for people, you're providing hospitality, a sense of belonging. This is all pre-coronavirus. And thereby building up relationships and helping people who may be quite poor in terms of their, I don't know, bureaucratic literacy, shall we say, to actually be able to access the system and work it out. And I know 1 or 2 churches, we want to encourage lots of churches actually in the diocese to achieve that. Presumably that's how it happened elsewhere. And I also wonder if there are other forms of partnership making that you'd particularly want to highlight.
I think that's a key one, isn't it, at local level? You know, just recognising that, you know, we certainly usually don't have the capacity to do everything. So actually, you know, building those relationships with other key partners around us is such a key thing. So, you know, really encourage you to be spending a bit of, you know, spend time working out, you know, which other groups and agencies are around who you can work with, and then, you know, working that out. And quite often, you know, we have got the space in order to do that, haven't we? Which quite often other people haven't got. and quite often we've got the time to do that little bit of creative thinking to get people together, which perhaps other people don't have time to do as well. So I think that's sort of, that's such a key piece of work. Yes, Billy, you can ask a question when you finish driving, so don't worry. And I think this comes in all sorts of ways, doesn't it? I mean, one of the interesting things for me, having moved into a cathedral, which obviously is much better resourced than St Bede's was, where I was just now, but it is the ability to work with partners just makes everything go further. You know, we've got a thing on a Tuesday morning at the moment, working with a local charity called Let's Feed Brum, who feed homeless people, where they bring their trailer outside the cathedral on a Tuesday morning and do hot breakfast, and I get to do pastoral work on top of that. So you know, it's working on those sorts of partnerships. I think there's, you know, schools are a really obvious partner. It doesn't all, you know, you can't always get into a school by right unless it's your Church of England school, but you know, secular schools are quite often really happy to have partners working with them. You know, we've got an agenda because we're the church, but it's not a hidden agenda. You know, we're usually not tricky to work with. So just try and work out everybody you can who you can work with, because that'll make things go further. I think there's thinking about sort of partnerships maybe a bit wider and a bit sort of beyond just individual parish church. So I think there's also you know, quite a lot of the things like the parachurch agencies are quite often looking for, you know, they're quite keen on working with estates, but quite often don't know how to do it. And I think if we can even give them a bit of a help, or say, you know, why don't you try something in my parish or something, that would be important. Something which I sort of fired into my brain when Jim was talking was, you know, you're talking about you gave it a bit of a risk to do the pancake thing because perhaps nobody would have turned up. But I think it's really important, you know, we have a go at things, you know, and sometimes they don't work, but it doesn't matter. You know, don't be, you know, but, you know, sometimes we need to keep going at something in order to get it going. And it's sort of discerning that and keeping courage. It's also knowing when to stop something, because sometimes things need to cease and we need to do something else. But also, you know, it doesn't matter if you have the odd disaster, you know, just kind of, you know, learn from it and try something else, and don't get discouraged by that. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, Bishop Simon, but I think if you look on the NECN website, there'll be lots of stuff about sort of different agencies and different people we can work with on that. Again, I mean, another thing we're trying to do with partnerships is just to encourage us to be looking beyond our diocese, because, you know, I think sometimes you know, there's a bit of strength in doing a bit of stuff together. So it's just working on all of that as far as we can. Is that okay? Does that sort of answer that? Good. Billy Joe, you're back. Did you have a question to ask?
I do. Sorry about that. I was picking up my son from school, but I'm loving the webinar so far. You may have covered this, but in terms of enabling those to join us, sorry, I should say I'm a lay minister in my church capacity. White middle class church, we have a council estate that they've been trying to engage with. We had a very evangelistic couple move in there to do the estates ministry and came alongside it. I've got a lot of friends now in that estate because I've been here in my context for like 11 years. But I find the most difficult part of engaging is the notion of the other members of my church who are amazing Christians who want to serve and do well, but they want to fix the existing issues within families, or they namely want to tell them that what's wrong and how they should be behaving. Is there resources or things out there whereby we can do a gentle study or something where we can enable those Christians to realise that actually sometimes they're the reason they're not engaging with the church any further?
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating issue, isn't it? Which isn't just where you are. It's in lots of places. That I think there's always a bit of a thing that we can kind of mistake Christian discipleship for middle class or bourgeois lifestyle. And you know, there are things in estate lifestyles which are wrong, you know, but equally there are things, you know, there are things which people might be living on estates which, you know, are completely fine, but quite challenging to some middle class church goers. So it's how we do that is quite interesting and quite tricky, I think. Because I think if, you know, people quite clearly, I mean, there'll be some people who want to go to middle class churches because that's how they can get out and leave and become middle class, which is fine. But, you know, that's not everybody. And I think people want to go to churches, I suspect, where they recognise themselves there. Does that make a bit of sense? So you want to kind of be affirmed. You might be challenged a bit, but you want to be affirmed that there are people who look like you and are you. Yeah, there's some Unreached by Tim Chester is a good book. There's another one. There's a bit of a Mad Elam guy in Lincoln called Darren Edwards, and
yes.
there's a little book either called, I can't remember if it's either called Chav Church or Chav Christianity, but that's interesting in terms of enculturating church. And he basically wrote it because I think he was a new Christian from the States, and he wanted to make, you know, affirm that his culture was all right. It's the only book of theology I've found which has got a chapter on farting in it, although he's bottled out on calling it farting. But anyway, I'm reminded that I went to a webinar over the summer which Bishop Simon was speaking at, and Bishop Simon was talking about the spirituality of the precariat and the need for the church to be able to reach people who are, you know, on estates or extreme needs, or people who are doing, you know, we'll all know families from our churches who are, you know, doing 3 jobs each in the gig economy and that sort of thing, and, you know, in a step away from disaster. How we can be reaching those, and then I think secondly be speaking and articulating and using ways of worship which can be actually hitting the spot with them. Does that make some sense? Have I paraphrased you right, Bishop Simon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just the sense that some people's lives are so difficult and actually so miserable, and with labour laws having been hacked away to nothing, and us being a new economic environment where actually people will be hired for 50 pence an hour at this rate. Some people are almost living lives like they've got a predator 2 yards behind them. And the idea that you can develop a spirituality, which we tend to do, I know we tend to do it in the Church of England, that's built round, I'm looking at mountains and streams and thinking nice thoughts in the spaces that I've got in this nice space when I'm feeling quite refreshed. It just isn't true. I'm not sure it's true for many people really, but it certainly isn't true for people in that context. And you're thinking, if there's a gospel for the poor, what's the spirituality then for people in that situation? And how is the Church of England, which is just, we are incurably highly literate in the way we express everything, how are we actually helping people to follow Jesus when they are, to use a term used earlier, Andy, knackered all the time?
I think that's right. And I think I was reflecting earlier on in the pandemic, you know, quite a lot of our scripture was written by people under extreme pressure, wasn't it? You know, it was, you know, thinking about, you know, the trauma of having seen Jesus be crucified and then, you know, them being persecuted, or the trauma of exile, or whatever, you know, trauma of Exodus. you know, you've got that around very much at the heart. And I think it's something about how we can make sure that we're producing, we're sort of living, not producing, we're being churches who are there where people don't feel they don't belong because they, you know, there's something there. And you know, I think if we get it right, it can be very beautiful. You know, you know, I can think of churches where you know, people come on a Sunday morning. You know, just one parent will come because one's come off of night shift who's coming with the kids, and the other parent's gone out to work. Or you can think of, I remember going to a diocesan leading a church into growth conference a few years ago, and I think this was where the estate life seekers come from, where in the car on the way, one of the people, I hadn't quite clocked this, I was quite embarrassed, I hadn't clocked this in advance, but one of the people I was taking to it said to me, I'm really glad we're going away this weekend. So I said, why, Janet? And she said, well, there's no food in the house. So I got there quickly and said to the people leading it, you need to give your examples so Janet doesn't feel left out. You know, because you know, some of it can be about. I think one of the things in the handbook was, you know, what are our values, and our values were around, you're reading it, around paying the mortgage, getting the kids into a good school, and something else. Well, for Janet, it was making sure there was food. So actually, you know, we need to be having a church which people like that feel they're part of without being patronised. I think is the thing. And I think, you know, it is quite a hard job sometimes as well, and those of us who are middle class will always have a bit of this in us, I think, that seeing other people as projects or things to fix or things to do good too. So how we can actually, you know, be taught by people who are on the edge rather than, which is where the gospel is, so it's not the edge. So slightly kind of wary of marginality language, because I think that sort of, again, can reinforce some of these things by the back door. There's quite an interesting bit of stuff, because this has been popping up a lot in conversations over the last couple of years, with, and I think we've got a little sort of informal project underway at the moment called Common Prayer, which has nothing to do with the Book of Common Prayer. It was the Roman Catholics on it said you need to call it Common Prayer, which is just about how we get the acts, how we get people who've been kind of inadvertently left out by the church due to class or finance or whatever, into the riches of the traditions of Christian spirituality. So it's quite, you know, and there are little things going on. I think we're just trying to get people together, just to have a bit of a reflect on that, and hopefully something will come out of that. I suspect once we can get back together, we'll have a bit of a conference to share a bit of good practice on that and think about that. But you know, a lot of stuff ranging from, you know, from how you might get kind of, you know, patterns of prayer going on by, like, which aren't too dependent on being able to read. So how you can get a simple office into people's hands, or how you can use kind of Ignatian you know, sort of patterns, something like the Examine. No, I had a really good curate once, and she was doing quite a lot of work with single mums off the estate with small children, and you know, they've got no time at all in their day, and I think it was just a bit of formation with them so that they could say the Examine while they were waiting for the kids to fall asleep, because that was a bit of still time, their one bit of still time in the day. So it's just thinking through all sorts of things like that, as to how, you know, how we can get stuff in the way. And as Billy Joe has just said in chat, there's quite often, as you say, it's quite often fear and stigma, isn't there, that, you know, for all sorts of historic reasons, people feel they've been pushed away when they're, you know, they're the ones who should be most in church rather than anybody else, because that's, you know, if we're true to the gospel, that's where we are. Anybody got anything else they wanted to raise or speak about?
It just occurred to me that one of the key things we've all got at our fingertips is the occasional offices, baptisms, weddings and funerals. I mean, locally, it's been a real challenge, and it was building up to get people to come back and seek the church as a place for their wedding. We had 3 weddings in the diary this year, which all got postponed to next year. Now, that was the first time in about 4 years there'd been so many weddings at the church. And they just felt embarrassed when they first made the inquiry. Is it possible for us to get married? We don't come to church, etc., etc. And you feel as if you've got to say, well, you don't have to come to church to get married, providing you can legally get married. And again, with the baptisms, they really felt embarrassed to come and ask, is it possible for my child to be baptized? I mean, a lot of our families, the parents aren't married, and they just feel that is a stumbling block. But if we turn them away at the first hurdle, they're not going to come back.
Absolutely.
And we have to acknowledge, the church has to acknowledge that the estate ministry is a bit different elsewhere. You know, we have to speak a language, as you went back very early on in the presentation, speak the language they understand. I mean, most of us probably have never had to worry about how to pay a mortgage. A lot of people don't know how to pay the rent, actually. That's the biggest worry locally, is how I'm going to pay the rent.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right with that. You know, it's how we can be, you know, we need good relationship with people, don't we, before we can be, you know, doing, you know, before people can enter into the faith.
Yeah.
And, you know, whatever connections we've got, just use them, and never be above people, because people always will spot that quite clearly. If you're the vicar, you're supposed to be odd and a bit different, so it doesn't matter. You know, I don't think there's anything to worry about with that. But you're not above people. You know, that's the key thing. I mean, remember when I sort of was the first incumbent on an estate, and you know, a couple of weeks in, you know, I spotted a neighbour who I hadn't managed to talk to before. So I sort of, you know, speedily went out to just to say hello to her. And she said, well, why are you talking to me? You know, and I think it was because my predecessors had kind of just ignored her. And you think, well, you know, actually, you know, she's my neighbour. And, you know, and I think with, you know, with occasional offices, you're absolutely right. You know, just do them as well as you can, because, you know, they can really sort of, I mean, they're evangelistic, they're good for people. Laurie Green wrote a book called Blessed Are the Poor, ? Which came out of lots of visiting estate churches around the country and listening to them. And he's got a really interesting bit in that on baptisms. And he says, firstly, most people who aren't in church call them christenings. So it's probably worth calling them christenings just because, you know, actually people know what you're talking about. But he also says, you know, they're possibly one of the very few times in the mother's life when she's going to be at the centre of things in a really positive way. You know, so thinking about the importance of that, you know, this is the, you know, one of the few times she's really making a, you know, and you know, and we all have to do, you know, well, you know, they're hard to do at the moment, aren't they, with the coming back from COVID, but when they're happening normally, whenever that will be, you know, we have to do them differently, don't we, in wherever we are, you know, working out how it works. But, you know, I can think of, you know, parishes I've been in where, you know, you do them on a Sunday afternoon because there are loads of people coming and it's very disruptive to Sunday mornings. You don't want to put the congregation through that too many times if you've got a lot of them. But actually, you know, I can think of ones where, you know, people have been really kind of noisy and you don't think they're there at all. But then you get to the sermon, which always been really short for a baptism, and you can, you know, you suddenly find you know, everybody's listening. And or it gets to, you know, when you get around the font to, you know, to actually do the baptism again, everybody is there. You know, they're such precious moments because you can really tell people are with you on that. So, you know, and some of them will come back to church, but others won't. So yeah.
In this context, Andy, and looking around the room at a group of clergy and lay leaders who are doing a great job, can often feel a little isolated, I guess, when they're working in their particular patch. What we're hoping to do as a diocese is at least have a larger support group than currently exists. I think until recently, it's probably only been about 3 or 4 of us in this group have been a part of that. And even looking around the Zoom today, on my stats earlier about the number of parishes that have over 500 social housing houses, I think only 1 in 4 of those parishes are represented here today. So there's some work to do there, but I'm just wondering if you could give us any advice about how local support groups have worked in other dioceses and what would be good, and indeed to take observations from other people around the room.
I mean, I think they all kind of work a bit differently in different areas. But I think having again, it's working it out. I mean, in some ways, you know, now we've gone on to Zoom, sometimes being able to do something more often without making people feel guilty if they can't get there, because we're all a bit, you know, in some ways a bit exhausted by this point, aren't we? We've all been had to be really creative and work really hard for the last 6 months, and you know, it's a bit of, you know, slump in some ways. What we did in Birmingham was to try and have about 3 things a year. So there'd be, we managed to get some funding so we could do an annual residential, and I know there's a couple of places have annual residentials, which I think can work out quite well, because I think actually, you know, it gets everybody out of the parish for a little bit, and you know, you get the you know, a lot of the benefit I think happens in the bar in the evening, where people can sort of build friendships really deeply.
At least until 10 o'clock.
At least until 10. Yeah, that's true. It needs to be. Yeah, you need to work out how you can do a lock-in. That's and then a couple of things, you know, like this, where there might be a speaker, or you might be looking at a theme. Quite often, actually, there's, you know, so much wisdom within the room that you don't always have to get external speakers in, particularly. I think there's some benefits sometimes on trying to do, you know, if you haven't got many people, but it sounds like you have, you know, sometimes doing things across diocese can sometimes work quite well. Some groups have a sort of like a little steering group that meets and plans stuff, and then comes up with stuff for everybody a bit wider. Plug into the national conferences that are going on. It's easy to do, and especially I would imagine everything's going to sort of, you know, even when we can get around to back to in-person stuff, I would imagine there'll be always be a streamed option now, because people are going to expect that, and it's easier, and especially, you know, if it's done that way, you don't have to travel across London to get to anything as well. Trying to think, but I think, I think it's probably just sort of discerning whether, you know, frequency of meeting, so that you're doing it helpfully, but not making people kind of feel guilty about things they can't get to at all. And I think the other thing is just to make sure, in its kind of ethos, it's supportive and missional, because I think there's always been a bit of a caricature of estate clergy meetings that everybody moans and sort of goes on about how they're misunderstood by everybody else, and how hard it is. And then if you're not careful, you just go home feeling awful. So you know, you need to have something to kind of, you know, to give, you know, is giving honest space to people to be able to let off steam, especially when it's quite difficult, but being able to, you know, get above that and get beyond that and kind of keep going.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's great. Thank you. Any other observations or questions from people? We've been going about an hour and a half now, and my experience of Zooms now over the last it's probably about an hour and a half is about as much as people can cope with, and doubtless people need to get on and do things also. But are there any other sort of final observations or questions that people have that they want to put? Roger. And
yeah, I mean, an observation and kind of a question that follows on from it, because in a bizarre way, lockdown happened just when we needed it in one particular context within this parish, because we got to a point where our message church team was completely, they were on their knees, but not because they were praying. We were so worn down, and we were kind of saying, well, maybe we need to take a break and reevaluate what we're doing and come back. And then lockdown happened, and we had to take the break. And so now we're kind of thinking through how might we start that again, because certainly in the past, Message Church was one of the ways in which we knew we were impacting on the estate within the parish, in ways that sort of traditional church just wasn't. And so it's really that thinking about how we do that kind of activity, which has relied so much on that sort of physical connection and the tactile nature of it in a COVID world where those things. One of the issues we've got with what we've tried to do during this time with the school is the school was so effective at getting a message out to the families about not taking things home and not sharing stuff between the children and that. When we tried to do something that was a take-home bag for Message Church, people said, we can't have that because we might be bringing the virus in. How do we deal with that kind of thing post-COVID?
I mean, I think there's an issue for all of us about capacity, isn't there, and being wise about that. And again, there's stuff which we've probably started doing during lockdown, which is going to be hard not to do. So I think if we're doing anything now which is online and streamed, say for our worship, we're probably going to have to work out ways of either continuing that or at least directing people to somebody else who's doing that, because there are going to be people who can't come back or have been in touch with us who can't physically come into church when that happens. So that and we're all, well, my observation, there's some clergy who don't do much, but most of us work pretty hard, so you can't suddenly just be doing more and more. So I think, as Roger said, there's stuff which has stopped, and I think it's that discernment as to actually how we do it, who will do it, because we will have lost some of our volunteers. Some people just aren't here anymore. We've had a lot of funerals. Equally, there are going to be people who perhaps aren't going to be able to come back physically. So actually, it's thinking about how we can do it, and what we need to prioritise, I would guess, would be part of that. So I think there probably will be some painful decisions to make on things we have to stop doing. But I think it's just working through. But what I would, I think if what's probably worth doing is seeing if you can get somebody to come in and help your PCC or ministry team or whatever think that through a bit, because those are quite tough decisions to make, really. I think it might be good to try and get somebody in to help reflect on that.
Last question again, Mike, did you want to ask a question? I think we'll leave the last observation or question to you, if that's okay.
Thank you. I'm fortunate to be about to be licensed to a church that sits right in the middle of an estate, right on a big parade of shops. And I just wondered if you had any pearls of wisdom about how to engage with those shops, with the local businesses. What might be a good way of approaching them and just sort of getting to know them and engaging?
What some colleagues have done is do a Christmas trail around the shops. So there might be, so you come and pick up I mean, whether you can do this in pandemic, I don't know, so probably not, but you might be something to plan for the future, or do at Easter perhaps, if things are back a bit more at Easter. But you come and pick up an activity sheet from the church, then you kind of might be kind of spotting kind of Christmas crib figures that you've put in each of the shops, so people are going round and possibly spending a bit of money in them when they're there. So that's the upside for the shop, is they get people coming through. And then when they've completed it, they come back to the church and they get a bar of chocolate or something.
Nice.
To say they've done it. Plus it means you can give out your invites to Christmas or Easter or whatever to families at the same time. That would just be one way of doing it. And I think just put yourself about and be in the shops and talking to them. And I think at the moment, with the pressure that a lot of businesses are under, just having somebody who can come in and say, you all right, and and build up a bit of relationship is, it's likely to be appreciated.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so, just to say thank you to Andy for giving us a good hour and a half, where you've been doing a lot of talking, quite rightly, but you're having to think on your feet a lot too when you do that, and really appreciate the astuteness and the thoughtfulness that's gone into what you said to us today. To all the participants here, to say how much we appreciate the work that you're doing and are really conscious of the contexts in which you're working, which are demanding, and which you're trying to address with real faithfulness and joy, and appreciate that hugely. I will be in touch in due course, I think, with this group and with also one or two others who signed up, as people do with webinars, but don't actually turn up in the end for one reason or another, to really work out how we go forward from here by way of support, which of course is entirely opt-in and voluntary on your part, but certainly want to be able to provide resources and support in a way that is sensitive to your particular needs. So if that's all, I think, for the moment, just to say, Andy, wish you all the best with Birmingham Cathedral. I hope it goes really well, and doubtless we'll see you again in different contexts. Thanks for all you did with the network. And there is that regional conference week on Thursday, which you can tap into as well if you want to follow up further. Otherwise, just remains for me to say thanks very much for joining us, and see you again in different contexts. See you in 6 months' time, when we're allowed to, or whenever it is.